You've probably heard the ballad, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. You know, the song by Gordon Lightfoot about the shipwreck on Lake Superior back in 1975. But what if this infamous disaster wasn't only a maritime tragedy, but a symbol for something bigger? In the new book, Wrecked, The Edmund Fitzgerald and the Sinking of the American Economy, Thomas Nelson argues that the loss of this ship and her crew was also a sign of the decline of U.S. industrial manufacturing. Today, we're here to discuss what this tells us about America, then and now. For Great Lakes Now, I'm Lisa John Rogers. Thomas, thank you so much for being here.
Great to be on. Thank you.
So, first of all, why this book and why now?
Well, that's a good question. And I think, like a lot of authors, they kind of noodle on, a topic like this. I think for me, it was the coming together of a couple of experiences and just some ideas and subjects that I was interested in. So I think, like a lot of people who are interested in the Fitzgerald, it goes back to when I was 7 or 8 years old, going up to the Valley Camp Museum in Sault Ste. Marie and just being just mesmerized by the display there. I mean, for a 7-year-old going up to the stern of the lifeboat of the Fitzgerald and just like ripped open like the jaws of a shark was just an image that I could never shake. And in my career as an elected official and being particularly interested in job creation and economic development, I kind of put two and two together that the Fitzgerald was more than just this maritime tragedy. It was more than just the subject of this, staple ballad on classic rock stations. But the Fitzgerald literally and figuratively carried the US economy in the 1960s, in the 1970s. And like the US economy, there was one decade where industrialism was thriving and doing well. And there was another decade where we saw this precipitous decline in industrialization. We saw it in Detroit, we saw it in Flint, we saw it here in Wisconsin, in the so-called Paper Valley, which is where I'm from, with pulp and paper mills. And what happened with the Fitzgerald ultimately, its demise was emblematic of how corporations were treating their employees, how they were or were not making key investments in their equipment and simply not putting workers first. And unfortunately, it's a lesson that we have not learned because the Fitzgerald story happens to so many corporations today where companies simply just don't treat their employees well. In the case of the Fitzgerald, those employees, those crew members, they pay the ultimate price.
You're currently working as the Outagamie County Executive. Formerly, you were the Wisconsin Assembly Majority Leader. How do you hope that this book contributes to current debates around things like infrastructure, policy, worker
Sure.
protections?
I think it's one thing to come at a voter or a constituency and talk just about the policy. Why are roads and bridges important? Why is healthcare important? But I think being able to use a story, to use a metaphor to explain the issue, I think can make it more compelling, can animate the priority, and then also allow it to make sense to a larger audience. And so my hope is that using Edmund Fitzgerald on the 50th anniversary of the sinking, that this will get attention and it will try to explain not just what happened in the 1970s, but what continues to plague corporate America and the American workforce to this day.
Your chapter, just called Toby, dives into what the lawyers uncovered in terms of what the companies were putting these families through in the aftermath of losing their loved ones. What did you find most striking about the legal aftermath of this disaster?
It's hard to really, pinpoint one thing that I learned because I learned a lot. And I talked to a number of subjects for which no one bothered to talk to me. And these were key people. I mean, the legal ramifications after the sinking of Fitzgerald were legion. And yet no one's really written about this. And so I spoke to 5 attorneys and a lead investigator for one law firm, so 2 law firms that were representing 5 of the family members, and they had what I would call, 2 smoking guns. Number 1, there was a deposition that was taken in federal court in December of 1977, and the person deposed was a guy by the name of Red Bergner, and we can think of him as the 30th crew member, okay? He was on medical leave, but he had sailed that year. And so the attorneys for these 5 families were able to track him down. At first, he was reluctant to speak because he was afraid, okay? He just did not want to be talking about this. This was a big deal. But he also said to the company, "Look, I'm not gonna say anything, but you have to take care of the spouse of one of my friends, Amy Cowman." And so what happened with that is they didn't listen to her, and they didn't listen to him, and so he spilled the beans. He went up to federal court to conduct a deposition, and he spilled the beans, and this is someone who knew the ship inside and out. And he talked about how terrible the condition was in. He talked about how the hull was being tack welded, okay? It was being patched up, okay? So when they would go in and they would scoop out all the grime, all the dirt after a season, and sometimes Fitzgerald was known as a wet ship. And so it took on a lot of ballast and it kept it. So sometimes that water and grime was over 6 feet high. And so Berger was down there. He had taken a coal shovel. He actually put it down under one of those tack welded pieces of steel. So this ship should never have been on the lake on November 9th and November 10th. It should not have. The other attorney, he happened, and so this is Toby Markovich from Superior, Wisconsin, and he had this picture of one of the crew members with his then girlfriend, and they were down in the ballast hold. And this picture that they took, it looked like this hairline crack that was going down there. He's like, "Wow, look at that." And so he sent it in to get it analyzed. And sure enough, they decided that that, in fact, was a structural defect. Okay. So these lawyers had more than enough to go after the companies and the insurance companies, um, and and they did. The problem is that the companies were clever and they went to a lot of these family members to get them to sign off. Okay, and so they would get a token payment, and that was it. Those families had no legal recourse. So the result is there was this disparity in settlements among the families. You had some families, maybe a couple $1,000s, and you had a couple of families that settled for 6 figures. And it is a topic, understandably, a sore topic among Fitzgerald families. Not that they're upset with one another, but just how everything happened in the mid to late 1970s.
Yeah. I also wanted to say, like, through the course of reading your book, I was really struck by how rich your interviews were with the families, and how much they trusted you with what they were sharing. And I'm curious of what your approach to, approaching these family members on like such a tragic personal experience. What was your approach to that?
That's a good question, and this is where my training as a politician really made a big difference. Having run for offices at the local, state, and federal level, I've knocked on a lot of doors. I've gone to a lot of fish fries, a lot of steak fries, and I have over the 21 years I've been in office, I've knocked on about 80,000 doors, okay? So I know how to talk to all kinds of people. And so I went to when I met Fred Armagast and when I talked to Bill Holm, Hom, or I'm sorry, Bob Hom, I knocked on their door. Literally, I just went there, knocked on the door, introduced myself, and some of them they actually want to talk about it. I thought when I talked to Fred Armagast, who was a little brother of Michael Armagast, who is the third mate, very important crew member, I thought, okay, so this guy gets bothered all the time, especially on anniversaries. He told me that was the first one to interview him 48 years after. So it was a very cathartic experience for him. It was a very enlightening experience for him, for me, and that was, I think, one of several reasons with these conversations, with these interviews, that I was able to put a really human side element to this. That my hope was that things were going to jump off the page and get the attention of people that may not have been interested in the political economy aspects or the dive itself. I mean, people can relate to people. And so that was a very important part of the book for me.
Yeah, yeah. You did a great job with that. In
Thank
writing
you.
in writing about deindustrialization and job loss, this kind of is related to that question, but how did you ensure that the voices of communities and families and workers were presented throughout this book?
I think that, that is a challenge that historians have in that we tend to talk about the great man theory, so to speak, how you have one person that drives history, when in fact there hasn't been a lot of storytelling from the so-called bottom up. And so this case, it wasn't just talking to the attorneys, it wasn't just talking to, companies, things like that, but it was talking to the people. It was talking about the people for which the demise of the Fitzgerald hurt affected the most, and that was the family and the friends of the crew members. So the number one priority is I wanted to do the memory right, and I want to be very respectful. There were some family members that did not want to go on record. There were some that asked me to go off the record, and those conversations were really, really interesting. But talking about that and respecting and appreciating those experiences, I was able to another goal was to try to assuage and alleviate some of the guilt that some family members have, because for the first 20 or 30 years, the big theory was how the hatches were not sealed. It's in the Gordon Lightfoot song. And that theory has basically been discounted. There's the talk about the three sister rogue waves, things like that. And so what I did through my research is I made a very, very strong case that if there was one group of people that had nothing to do with this, it was the workers. That this was a ship that was not seaworthy, should never have been out on that. So I'm telling their stories, but I'm also trying to assuage these concerns and put to rest any talk that this had anything to do with the crew members.
Yeah, all of that was so enlightening. I feel like I came away from reading your book with having a very different perspective on the wreck itself. And on that topic, too, or closely related to that, how would you respond to critics who might argue that your larger point, right? They might argue that deindustrialization was inevitable due to globalization or automation rather than the results of just policy or negligence.
No, deindustrialization, that was a choice. That was a conscious choice that our policymakers, our elected officials made. And the reason why is because there were any number of already industrialized countries at the time, West Germany, Japan, that thrived. And the reason why they thrived is because those countries had what is called a national industrial strategy. It's something that the United States never had. They made conscious decisions to say, we are going to support this particular industry because it has everything to do with economic security and national security. And so there was a lot of government investment and support for shipbuilding. We don't have that anymore practically. Okay. They made sure that if there were free trade agreements with another country, that they were balanced. In the case of the United States, we unilaterally disarmed. Okay. So we opened our markets up to countries like at the time West Germany, uh, Japan, when at the same time they kept tariffs on, they kept protections on. So like we were just our market was just flooded. The domestic market was flooded with U.S. products and nowhere to go, depressed prices. Companies went out of business, people lost jobs. No, absolutely not. That was never inevitable. And the reason why we know this is because we never had a national industrial strategy. Other countries did, and they succeeded. And right now, or at least during the Biden administration, they were talking about an industrial strategy with the CHIPS Act, for example, that
Right.
targeted specifically the semiconductors and microchips and so forth. So, no, this was a conscious decision by elected officials and policymakers at the time.
At the end of your book, you talk about the false mindset around things like good jobs versus a healthy environment and how that dichotomy has plagued public policy decisions. Yet there's hope. I'm wondering if you could expand on this. What do you find hopeful here?
Yeah, and I think what you're pointing to is something that is known as the blue green coalition, where you have blue collar workers with environmentalists who absolutely reject the notion that it's an either or. And in the book, in the chapter, I dive, so to speak, go into talking about Lake Superior. And there's no other book that I've read on this topic. I think I read most, if not all of them, that dedicates a chapter talking about where this all happened, Lake Superior, and how this lake is unique. 30,000 square miles, the second largest lake in the world. I mean, you know all this. That's the title of this program. Um, and and in that case, there was a federal court case in which there was a mining company that was dumping tailings into Lake Superior, and some people are saying, "Oh, we need to pollute we need to do this. We need to do this because, hey, the lake's really big anyhow, and this is how we have jobs." And the local labor union, the steel workers, combined with the local federal judge, said, "No, no, no, no. This is not right. We can have it both ways. Okay? This corporation needs to be responsible." Oh, and by the way, one of the majority owner in this particular company was either Ogilvy Norton or Northwestern Mutual. Okay, so there was this relationship within industries and between industries that they were going to discount the welfare, the well being of the people and the workers, and that's a common theme here too, though. But we can look back at this example from the 1960s and 70s in which you had labor unions near the Iron Range in Minnesota that were working with environmentalists saying that we can do better in our community. This is not a zero-sum game. And so I think that there's a lot of lessons in that history that we can apply today.
Yeah, I was doing research on the first Earth Day, and I was actually very inspired by the fact that Walter P. Reuther, who was like the head of the UAW at the time, funded a lot of the organization leading up to that event. So I think that there is that history of labor and the environmental movement that it's there, you know? It doesn't have to be um, a dichotomy like it is now. Um,
Yeah, and as you know too, that Walter Reuther, he was one of the founding members of the CIO, and it was the more progressive arm of the now AFL-CIO, where the AFL was focused on the trades, and the CIO was more at an industrial level, thinking holistically, okay, how can we use labor unions for the betterment of all? And so that was Walter's mindset all the time. So I actually didn't realize that he was part of Earth Day, though, but it doesn't surprise me.
so, last question here. What do you want readers to take away from this story?
I want readers to think that when they hear about the Edmund Fitzgerald, that it's not just about a song, it's not just a maritime strategy, but it is a cautionary tale. It's what happens when companies, when the government, when they don't do the right thing, when they don't invest in industry, they don't support workers, they don't have the necessary worker protections, they don't have the priorities in the right place. This is what can happen. And this still happens. And so I don't think we've done right by the memory of the 29 fallen. They're the ones who pay the ultimate price. But I also want to make sure that people who are focused on the Fitzgerald, that the Fitzgerald is also more than about these theories about what happened between 7 and 7:30 on November 10th. That you have to go to the beginning, back to 1957, where the design for the ship was kind of shoddy, where it was not kept up and maintained, where the American Bureau of Shipbuilding looked the other way and didn't make the necessary, didn't, raise enough flags, and it came to that spot. So I want people to know that one, this was not the this was far, far, far away from any crew member's fault, that this was an example of what continues to happen today when corporations and government are not doing the right thing, and there's still time to change. There's still time to learn these lessons so that for the next generation, we can make sure that there's not gonna be another Fitzgerald sinking.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today, Thomas. This was a great discussion, and it was such a pleasure reading your book. You did such a fabulous job on it, and I appreciate you taking the time to chat
Thank
with
you.
us today.
Thank you. Good to be on.
For more information about Wrecked, the Edmund Fitzgerald, and the sinking of the American economy, you'll find an excerpt of the chapter Just Call Toby on greatlakesnow.org. You can find that in the links in our description or show notes. To grab a copy of the book, head over to bookshop.org or check out a copy from your local library. And to hear more about the history of the Great Lakes region, subscribe to our YouTube channel and the Great Lakes Now newsletter. You can find it at greatlakesnow.org.